what is economics for? It is the why, or normative question, that economics tends to avoid, rather than the how question.
The word economics comes from Greek oikonomike, and oikonomike was an adjective, not a noun. Now, in the Greek language, adjectives are supposed to follow the nature of the corresponding noun. So in this case, oikonomike was put by Aristotle at the service of politics, politike. In other words, economics originally, when it was born, both the word and the meaning was conceptualized as all type of activities which are targeted at the common good. Because for Aristotle, politics is aimed at common good. And that went on until 1650. The present-day dominant economic paradigm, which is also called mainstream, suffers of a legitimacy crisis. Why? The first reason has to do with the anthropological assumption.
The anthropological assumptions behind current mainstream economic thought arose from the Enlightenment synthesis. The Enlightenment thinkers were trying to address a particular set of problems at that time, which led them to put individual human freedom, as it had been presented in medieval thought by nominalism, at the center. This was a radical change from the past, where all mainstream thinking had put the social or civic order in the center.
In 1615, a French economist, not very well known, published in French a book whose title was A Traité of Political Economy. When you say political economy, economy becomes a noun, no longer an adjective. The adjective is political. So, with that small book, the major change was that economics is no longer at the service of the common good. The vice versa. Politics is at the service of economics. Because economics was meant to represent only the material side of life.
On va créer des besoins par la publicité, par le fait de donner envie de quelque chose dont au départ on n'a pas besoin, mais finalement on va éprouver le besoin de l'avoir, donc on va créer du besoin nouveau, on pourrait dire de manière un peu artificielle. Les gens qui font la queue devant les magasins pour attendre le nouveau téléphone le plus moderne éprouvent un besoin d'avoir ce téléphone, alors qu'ils vivaient très bien avant, mais ils éprouvent un besoin.
The language of economics became mathematics. Economic decisions and transactions had a life of their own according to the laws of individual self-interested behavior, and ethics became a kind of external and artificial constraint on the domain of economics rather than something intrinsic to it. This model still permeates our thinking so thoroughly that we do not even notice it.
In the 20th century, probably, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, after Keynes, after Schumpeter, after great economists, based on big pictures like ideologies, socialism, liberalism, capitalism, Marxism, then in that time, economics, being a theoretical science with this capacity of giving the sort of economic system with mathematics, physics, that was very fascinating. And then economics was considered to be the queen of the social sciences, was defined by people like Gary Baker, Milton Friedman, and other people. But with the new millennium, in the 21st century, if you look at the world, economics as a science, mathematical formal science, is not anymore so popular.
Modern scientific results in various subdisciplines of economics, like behavioral economics, as well as other areas like neuroscience, genetics, evolutionary biology, and the field of happiness research, they are all showing us that the individualistic anthropology on which mainstream economics is based is primitive. It's not completely wrong, but is a kind of cartoonish and incomplete version of what it means to be human. For example, studies show that people do not always respond to financial incentives the way mainstream economic theory might expect them to. In fact, financial incentives may cause performance to decline by undermining intrinsic motivation. Other studies suggest that most people identify more closely with, and presumably are more motivated by, values such as helpfulness, honesty, and justice than with wealth, status, or power. Religious traditions and older philosophical traditions, such as that of Aristotle, have anticipated these results. What kind of guidance could we take from the ancient wisdom traditions, including the Christian tradition, for economics today? First, these traditions would suggest that we need an economics that is built on a relational view of the human person, in which we do not only relate to others in order to fulfill individual objectives, but also realize ourselves and our shared objectives through achieving shared goals, in friendships, for instance. We need an economic theory that starts from the much more realistic, personalist idea of the human being than the Homo economicus, that is, the individual that only looks after his own or her own self-interest.
Mainstream is based on the Homo economicus anthropological assumption. This assumption derives from an older position taken by Thomas Hobbes in 1651, which is Homo homini lupus, which means every man is a wolf vis-à-vis another man. And Homo economicus is just a translation into the economic language of that assumption. Now, even a child understands why it cannot work. Because if I assume that you are a wolf who tries to bite me, I will, first of all, never trust you. Second, I have to defend myself. And in defending myself, I waste a lot of resources. Look how many resources are spent today in order to protect private property, many other things. Why is that so? Because people do not trust each other.
What is missing in the economy? I think we all claim for a more relational economics, relational theory, more open to interactions, not just commercial interaction, but human interaction all over the market. Fraternity refers to some dimension of interpersonal relations, some dimensions of community, good life in community. But when we use the expression of fraternity, we refer to something horizontal, a relationship among equal people. I use in my work, in my research, fraternity as a sort of paradigm even for market relationships between suppliers and clients, between colleagues in the same company, even between normal relationship in shops. When you go just for a few minutes, you can leave what is going on in the bakery, or in any kind of shop. Is a sort of personalized, not totally impersonal relationships, because you can live that few moments, a few minutes, as something more humane, more dense of emotions than just mutual indifference. I give you money, you give me bread without any contact. Part of my research activity is about how to describe the market as a fraternal place, potential fraternal place, where relational goods are possible, where emotions are possible, even though we are in a full commercial setting. Then it's possible a fraternal economics.
La fraternité, c'est d'avoir des mêmes parents, de venir de la même origine. On pourrait dire que avoir les mêmes parents, c'est avoir un point commun, un point de contact ensemble, un point de référence commun pour tous les économistes. Chez Thomas d'Aquin, donc au Moyen-Âge, au XIIIe siècle, dans son développement sur l'activité économique, il y a un point d'accès universel dans lequel tous pourraient se retrouver. D'abord, il a une conception du besoin. Il ne va pas parler d'utilité, comme le feront les économistes à l'époque moderne, mais du besoin. Et la notion qu'il a du besoin, c'est un besoin de choses nécessaires. Adam Smith, le fondateur de l'économie politique, 500 ans plus tard, parlera des choses nécessaires et commodes à la vie. Pour Thomas, il s'agit simplement des choses nécessaires. Et ça peut être un bon point d'appui. L'être humain est fait pour l'échange, mais cet échange, il est fait pour satisfaire les besoins et d'abord les besoins nécessaires. Le deuxième aspect, j'en viens d'en dire un mot, c'est la notion d'échange. L'être humain est fait pour échanger et c'est la clé chez Thomas de l'activité économique. C'est l'échange dans l'intérêt des parties. L'échange n'a lieu que si chacun des co-contractants y gagne.
Second, these traditions can raise the question of human freedom as freedom for something, freedom to develop ourselves, to become the people we could be, turning our potential into reality. Amartya Sen's idea of capabilities and functionings, such as in his book Development as Freedom, goes in a similar direction. Caring as well as competing helps us develop. Care for internal resources naturally reflects an attitude that must be applied to external resources as well. Thus, it also has an impact on the concept of sustainability and intergenerational relationships.
The idea with Amartya Sen, we talk about capabilities, okay, but there are also spiritual capabilities. Then all this attention to the inner life that is so weak among economists that I consider part of private sphere, not a public. But spiritual capital is a capital, like social capital, like financial capital. And then if we don't work, even in business, in economics, in spirituality, the next COVID pandemic will be depression, because without spiritual capital, people don't survive.
The second drawback of mainstream is due to the fact that they consider that the only pillars of social order are state and market. Now, again, that is nonsense. Why? Because a society includes certainly the state, no doubt, the market, but includes also community. By community, we mean intermediate bodies. We mean civil society organizations. Family belongs to the community, association of various kinds, NGOs, etc. So it is obvious that the attempt to categorize economic behavior within the narrow scope of either market or the states prevents mainstreams to understand the actual phenomena, and as a consequence, the unable to suggest policy prescription to the policy makers and in general to people.
Il y a en Italie la tradition de l'économie civile, qui est une tradition très importante, qui a donné beaucoup de fruits. En France, on a une tradition plus récente, mais de l'économie sociale ou économie sociale et solidaire. On va chercher de nouvelles formes d'entrepreneuriat, de nouvelles formes de structures économiques entre le modèle associatif et puis le modèle de l'entreprise qui cherche à faire du profit, le modèle de l'association qui ne fait pas de profit. Il y a une sorte de troisième voie qui se développe en France pour trouver des modalités d'une économie plus solidaire et plus sociale. Et je crois que ça c'est très important de pouvoir encourager ces démarches dans leur diversité pour pouvoir aider à bâtir un monde plus fraternel.
Third, these traditions raise the question of the meaning of the economy. What is economics for? These traditions would suggest that economics is for human development, for instance, and the development of the systems of life more generally. It is mainly to fulfill human needs rather than maximizing individual gain and rationalizing resources that we need the economy. This premise changes approaches and perspectives, strategies and development models.
The fact that for mainstream, what is the purpose, the goal? of economic activity, to maximize total good. Again, total good means GDP, gross domestic product. In other words, the total goods takes into consideration only the value of commodities or services passing through the market and receiving a price. So the total good is the sum total of the prices times the quantity produced and sold. But there are many goods and let's say services which are of fundamental importance to our life, which do not pass through the market, neither through the state or the government. And so that is why mainstream economics is reductionist, because it does not take into consideration what human beings as such, for instance, consider love. You cannot include in the total good the value of love, because love has no price. That is, by love I mean what the Greek called agape. For instance, if you are to a child, a kiss by a father or a mother, or a sign of gratitude or consolations are in fundamental goods, but they do not receive a price. And so they are excluded from the calculations of GDP.
Economics is basically about private goods. That we are beautiful in describing market with private goods, but we fade with the commons, with the common goods. Commons is about relationships, and then commons is also environment. Common is public goods also. But then without an economics for commons, I think surviving of our species will be very, very hard in the future, because the future and the present are more about commons than private goods. I think another dimension that is important that is the earth, the land, the old attention to the natural environment that was totally absent, lacking in the political economy, in traditional political economy. Now is a bit better, but the whole structure of economics is based in mutual advantage, but mutual among humans, not mutual with the earth.
Dans la Bible en latin, dans la Vulgate en latin, dans le livre de la Genèse, le verbe « produire » est utilisé pour parler de la production de la terre ou de l'eau, ou dans le Nouveau Testament, ce sont les arbres qui produisent, mais ce ne sont jamais les êtres humains qui produisent, dans un sens économique. Et Thomas garde cette tradition du verbe « produire » dans son sens classique en latin, et ce n'est qu'à partir du XVIIe, XVIIIe siècle que le verbe « produire » et le nom « production » prendront un sens où ce sera vraiment une activité humaine, et ce sera l'homme qui produira. Et je crois que ce n'est pas anodin du tout, parce qu'à partir du moment où c'est l'être humain qui produit, l'être humain met la main sur la terre et la domine. Alors que chez Thomas, c'est vraiment la terre qui produit, et l'être humain reçoit ce que la terre produit, et puis il transforme ce qu'il reçoit. C'est le travail de l'artisan ou du paysan. Il le transporte et il le vend, c'est le travail du marchand, pour satisfaire les besoins. Ça peut concerner bien sûr les croyants, qui verront dans la production de la terre le signe de l'action de Dieu, providence, qui vient nous nourrir les hommes. Ça peut aussi parler aux non-croyants, qui vont simplement voir dans la production de la terre ce qui permet la survie de l'espèce. Et puis, ça peut aussi parler aux personnes venant des cultures traditionnelles et qui ont cette image de la terre-mère que nous connaissons bien. Je crois que l'idée de fraternité, elle n'est pas spontanée pour un économiste. Un économiste, on peut lui parler de consommation, de production, de gains, d'échanges, de prix, de salaire, mais de fraternité, ça lui semble un peu lointain. Cependant, en y réfléchissant, la notion de fraternité nous amène à approfondir justement cette idée de pouvoir dialoguer ensemble. Pour être frère, il faut pouvoir se parler. Et donc être frère, c'est quoi? Être frère et sœur, c'est avoir les mêmes parents, c'est venir d'une même origine. Et finalement, en économie, mais dans toutes les disciplines, pour être frère et sœur, eh bien, il faut pouvoir avoir non pas les mêmes parents au sens strict, mais les mêmes références, la même origine intellectuelle, quelques points fondamentaux communs à tous pour pouvoir échanger.